she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot, and her last words were an apology. Marie Antoinette, the former Queen of France, was ascending the steps of the guillotine when she stumbled and stepped on Charles-Henri Sanson's foot. "Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose," she said, maintaining royal etiquette even with her hands bound and death mere seconds away. It was October 16th, 1793, at 12:15 p.m. In 15 seconds, the 60-kilogram blade would fall and sever the head of France's most hated woman. But what you might not know is that this execution was the result of one of history's most manipulated trials, based on accusations of incest with her own son, systematic psychological torture, and a hate campaign that transformed a 14-year-old Austrian girl into the scapegoat of a bloody revolution. Now she was merely prisoner 280 from the conciergerie prison, her hair roughly cut, wearing a simple white dress, and suffering from constant hemorrhages that stained her clothes with blood. 30,000 soldiers formed a security cordon along the execution route, not to protect her, but to ensure she arrived alive at the guillotine. And later, I'll show you exactly how this execution transformed into the French Revolution's biggest strategic blunder, creating an international martyr who destroyed Republican credibility for generations. But first, you need to understand what truly happened during the 2.5 months Marie Antoinette rotted in Paris's most sinister prison. Marie Antoinette was transferred there on August 2nd, 1793, and from the very first moment, her mental destruction began. She was placed in cell number 6, a damp cubicle 2 meters by 2.5 meters, with a single barred window that let in just enough light to witness her own misery. But the worst wasn't the dampness or the lack of space, it was the constant surveillance. 2 guards sat inside the cell 24 hours a day, observing her every move. Her only privacy was a 2-meter-tall curtain behind which she could change and use the toilet. But the guards remained on the other side, listening to every sound. She couldn't cry in silence, couldn't pray in peace, couldn't even sleep without being watched like an animal on display. The former queen slept on a straw bed infested with rats and insects. Her meals consisted of watery soup, hardened black bread, and water that was often contaminated. She lost 15 kilograms in 2 months. And her hair, once blonde and silky, turned completely white from stress. At 37 years old, she looked 60. Her nails grew long and dirty because she had no instruments to cut them. Clothes, washed only once a week, smelled of sweat and urine. The guards had specific orders to treat her not as a former queen, but as a common criminal. They called her Citizen Capet, or simply Prisoner 280. When she tried to maintain some dignity by sitting upright, they forced her to relax, like a republic. When she tried to pray, they deliberately made noise to interrupt her. Hundreds of people paraded daily in front of her cell, pointing, laughing, spitting, making obscene comments about her body and appearance. She was forced to endure this daily humiliation, always observed, always judged, always treated as a trophy of the revolution. Marie Antoinette was suffering from constant hemorrhages, likely uterine cancer or fibroids caused by early menopause. Bloodstains constantly appeared on her clothes, but she received no adequate medical treatment. The revolutionaries considered any special care for her a betrayal of the Republic. She lived with constant pain, bleeding that left her weak and dizzy, and no medication to alleviate the suffering. They brought news that almost completely destroyed her sanity. Her best friend, the Princess de Lamballe, had been murdered during the September massacres. But it wasn't just a murder, it was sadistic torture that lasted hours. Lamballe was tied up, stripped, and dragged through the streets of Paris by a savage mob. Her body was mutilated, her private parts cut off, and her head severed. The climax of the cruelty came when the mob raised Lamballe's head on a pike and brought it to Marie Antoinette's cell window, screaming for her to kiss the head of her dead friend. The former queen fainted in horror, and when she awoke, she vomited for hours straight. This psychological trauma left her in a state of shock for weeks, during which she could barely speak or eat. He managed to enter the prison as a visitor and dropped a carnation at Marie Antoinette's feet. Inside the petals was a note detailing a plan to get her out of Paris in a carriage that would take her to Germany. For a moment, she had hope. The guards found the note and the letters Marie Antoinette had written in response, trying to coordinate the escape. The punishment was immediate and brutal. She was transferred to an even smaller cell. Surveillance was intensified, and any privileges she still had were removed. Now she knew there was no escape. Her only way out of the conciergerie would be through the guillotine. The Revolutionary Tribunal had already decided the verdict even before Marie Antoinette entered. The public prosecutor, Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, had received direct orders from Maximilien Robespierre. She was to be condemned to death, no matter what evidence was presented. The accusations were a mixture of real crimes, half-truths, and completely fabricated lies. She was accused of high treason for sending military secrets to Austria. This was true. She was accused of depleting the national treasury with her spending. This was false. Her personal expenses accounted for less than 2% of the royal budget. She was accused of conspiring with foreign powers against the security of France. This was partially true, as she did hope foreign armies would restore the monarchy. The accusers claimed that Marie Antoinette and her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, had subjected the 8-year-old boy, Louis Charles, to criminal sexual relations, with the aim of weakening his physical condition so he would be easier to control when he became king. This accusation was based on a confession extracted from Marie Antoinette's own son through methods that today we would recognize as child abuse. The 8-year-old boy had been separated from his mother, placed under the guardianship of an illiterate shoemaker named Antoine Simon, who regularly got him drunk and forced him to sing the Marseillaise. Under constant psychological pressure, aggressive interrogations, and possibly physical torture, the child was forced to sign a confession accusing his own mother of sexual. Finally, she rose and uttered the words that would become her moral epitaph. If I have not replied, it is because nature herself refuses to answer such a charge brought against a mother. I appeal to all those who are here. Even the hostile crowd in the courtroom fell momentarily silent. Some women began to cry. For an instant, basic humanity triumphed over political hatred. Most testimonies consisted of rumors, speculation, and second-hand stories. The tribunal itself was packed with Robespierre's supporters. A surgeon, a bookseller, a shoemaker, a wig maker, a cafe owner, 2 carpenters, men chosen not for their legal qualifications, but for their loyalty to the revolution. Her 2 defenders, Claude Chauveau-Lagarde and Guillaume Tronçon-Ducoudray, had only 1 day to prepare the defense and were prevented from presenting favorable witnesses or exculpatory evidence. The tribunal systematically rejected all defense requests and automatically accepted all prosecution accusations, no matter how absurd they were. In the early hours of October 16th, 4 in the morning, the verdict was announced. Guilty of high treason, conspiracy with foreign powers, and depleting the national treasury. The sentence: death by guillotine. When asked if she had anything to say, Marie Antoinette simply shook her head in silence. She knew anything she said would be used against her. She chose to write to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, but the letter never reached its destination. The public prosecutor Fouquier-Tinville intercepted the letter and delivered it to Louis XVIII after the Restoration. In the letter she wrote, "I die free of hatred for those who condemn me. I hope that my death will be useful for the happiness of France, and that you, my poor children, will be happier under the new government." In other parts of the letter, she referred to her executioners as murderers and expressed her despair at leaving her children orphans at such a tender age. She knew she was dying not for justice, but for political convenience. Her execution was necessary to consolidate the revolution, not to punish actual crimes. First, he cut her hair to the nape of her neck, not for practical necessity, but for symbolic humiliation. Long hair was a symbol of femininity, nobility. Cutting it was a way to strip her of her identity as a woman, queen. Then he tied her hands behind her back with a thick rope that cut into her skin. She asked to use the restroom one last time, and was forced to do so with her hands bound, in front of the male guards. This final humiliation was deliberate. The revolutionaries wanted to ensure she lost all dignity before she died. Marie Antoinette was forced to sit on a wooden plank, completely exposed to the stares and insults of the crowd that had gathered along the entire room. Her eyes were sunken and red from crying. Her skin was pale and wrinkled. Her lips were pressed into a thin line of forced determination. She no longer looked like a 37-year-old queen. She looked like an old, indigent woman being led to her death. The crowd that gathered in the streets showed no mercy. People shouted, "Death to the Austrian," and "Down with the she-wolf." Some threw mud and stones at the cart. Others made obscene gestures and yelled about what they wanted to do with her body after the execution. Marie Antoinette kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to give her tormentors the satisfaction of seeing her break. It's estimated that over 100,000 people gathered to witness the former queen's execution. Windows, rooftops, and any available vantage point were packed with spectators. Street vendors circulated through the crowd selling food, drink, and souvenirs commemorating the death of the widow Capet. The machine itself was a sinister feat of engineering. 2 vertical oak posts 4 meters high, connected by a horizontal crossbar. Between the posts were polished metal rails in which a 60-kilogram slanted steel blade slid. The guillotine had been invented as a humane method of execution. The idea was that death would be instantaneous and painless, but in practice, the machine was often poorly maintained. The blade grew dull with repeated use, and sometimes multiple attempts were needed to fully sever the head. Marie Antoinette was fortunate that the guillotine was working perfectly. Its blade had been sharpened the morning before, and the mechanism had been tested with melons to ensure smooth operation. Upon descending from the cart, Marie Antoinette ascended the scaffold steps with more dignity than anyone expected. Despite her hands being bound and her body weakened by months of imprisonment and illness, she walked upright and needed no assistance. It was at this moment that she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot and murmured her famous last words, "Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." Even facing a violent and humiliating death, she instinctively followed the rules of courtesy that had been ingrained in her since childhood. It was a reminder that, beneath all the accusations and propaganda, she was simply a polite woman trying to maintain some semblance of dignity in an impossible situation. She knelt and placed her neck on the wooden block. A wooden frame closed around her, holding her in place. Her last act was to try and keep her eyes open, refusing to show fear even in her final second. The 60-kilogram weight fell down the metal rails and severed Marie Antoinette's head in a fraction of a second. The crowd erupted in shouts of, "Long live the Republic! Long live liberty!" Sanson picked up the head by its short hair and displayed it to the crowd in all directions, ensuring everyone could see that the former queen was truly dead. Her body was placed in a cheap wooden coffin along with her head, and the entire ensemble was thrown into a common grave at the Madeleine Cemetery. Lime was poured over the remains to accelerate decomposition and prevent the site from becoming a sanctuary for royalists. This was the final attempt to erase Marie Antoinette from history, not just to kill her, but to ensure her body completely disappeared. Marie Antoinette's execution, far from consolidating the revolution, marked the beginning of its moral decline in the eyes of Europe and even many French people. The image of a mother separated from her children, psychologically tortured for months, and then executed based on fabricated incest accusations, shocked the European conscience. Within a week of the execution, Robespierre was receiving letters from French Republicans expressing horror at what had been done. The incest accusation, in particular, was seen as so obviously false and cruel that it destroyed the revolution's moral credibility. If the revolutionaries were capable of torturing a child to extract false confessions against his own mother, what other crimes were they capable of committing? Many identified with Marie Antoinette as a mother and wife, regardless of their political opinions about the monarchy. The image of her walking with dignity to her death, after months of humiliation and suffering, created a posthumous sympathy that had never existed in her lifetime. Internationally, the execution was seen as proof that France had become a terrorist state incapable of civilized behavior. European coalitions that previously had limited objective, perhaps restoring some borders, curbing French expansion, now had an existential goal: to completely destroy the French revolutionary regime. The war ceased to be about politics and became about morality. Even more dramatically, the execution accelerated the very destruction of the Reign of Terror. Robespierre discovered that once you legitimize the murder of innocent mothers based on fabricated accusation, it's impossible to control where that logic stops. Within 10 months, he himself was guillotined by the same methods he had used against Marie Antoinette. The revolution literally devoured itself. Marie Antoinette's son, Louis Charles, never recovered from the psychological torture he had endured to extract the false confession against his mother. He died in prison on August 10, 1795, at 10 years old, from tuberculosis and malnutrition. But he likely died primarily from guilt and trauma for having been forced to lie about his own mother. His death was essentially a child suicide caused by the revolutionary. She spent the rest of her life documenting her family's suffering and contradicting the revolutionary propaganda about her mother. Her memoirs became some of the most powerful documents against the official version of revolutionary history. In 1815, when the monarchy was restored, King Louis XIII ordered Marie Antoinette's remains to be found and transferred to the Basilica of Saint-Denis, where French kings were traditionally buried. It was an almost impossible task, because the lime had destroyed most of the remains, but some fragments were identified and buried with full royal honors. Louis XVIII also ordered the construction of 2 memorial chapels, one at Place Louis XVI, now Place de la Concorde, marking the execution site, and another within the conciergerie itself, in the cell where Marie Antoinette had suffered her final months. These chapels became pilgrimage sites for royalists and anyone opposed to political extremism. The tactic of separating mothers from their children, using the children to extract false confessions, and then executing the mothers based on these confessions, would become a standard tool for totalitarian regimes for the next 2 centuries. Marie Antoinette's story also revealed something fundamental about the nature of political propaganda. During her life, she was systematically demonized as an irresponsible spender, a foreign spy, and a sexual pervert. Almost none of this was true. Her personal expenses were modest for her. Her espionage consisted mainly of personal letters to her family in Austria, and there is no credible evidence of any improper sexual behavior. But the propaganda worked so well that even today, over 200 years later, many people still believe Marie Antoinette said, "Let them eat cake," when she learned the people had no bread, a phrase that was completely invented by her enemies. The real Marie Antoinette spent much of her time organizing charity for the poor and expressing concern for popular suffering. The revolutionaries needed a scapegoat for France's problem, and Marie Antoinette was the perfect target. Foreign, female, wealthy, and without real political power to defend herself. The fact that she was fundamentally innocent of the crimes for which she was executed became irrelevant. Marie Antoinette's tragedy was not just personal, it was civilizational. Her execution marked the moment when the French Revolution crossed the line between political reform and totalitarian barbarism. It was the point at which a cause that had begun with noble ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity transformed into something indistinguishable from the tyranny it had tried to replace. The woman who died at 37, losing her head to a guillotine in Paris, had become the unwitting symbol of all innocent victims of political extremism. Her dignity in the face of unjust death, her refusal to break under torture, and her maintenance of basic humanity, even when confronted with systematic inhumanity, made her an icon of moral resistance. Today, when visitors go to the Conciergerie and see the reconstruction of her cell, or when they go to the Place de la Concorde and see the site where she died, they are not just seeing landmarks of the French Revolution. They are seeing reminders that some of history's greatest injustices were committed in the name of the greatest causes, and that the true measure of a society is not whether its ideals are noble, but whether it is capable of treating its enemies with basic humanity. Marie Antoinette's execution was far more brutal than you imagine, not just because of the physical suffering. It was brutal in its demonstration of how quickly a civilized society can transform into something monstrous when it allows political hatred to replace human justice. Her death was not just the end of a queen, it was the end of an idea, the idea that there is a limit to what a just cause can do in the name of its idea. And even today, her death continues to serve as a warning about what happens when we allow our pursuit of justice to turn into a pursuit of vengeance.